We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. In yet another of their inimitable decisions, the conservative majority of the United States Supreme Court has ruled, as was expected and as was inevitable in the case of the state of West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency. They have ruled to eviscerate that agency's regulatory power to protect the environment. Here to discuss that ruling with us now is a West Virginia-based attorney who ran against the Attorney General, the current Attorney General for West Virginia. My guest's name is Sam Brown Petsonk. He was the Democratic candidate in 2020, and he knows a great deal about, as you might expect, about West Virginia environmental law and environmental law in general. So first of all, Sam Brown Petsonk, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thanks for having me.
Secondly, if you'd have won, the world would look a little different right now.
Well, let me apologize to the world at the outset because I did not win that election, but we fought as hard as we could manage to fight here because we know this was Patrick Morrisey's goal all along. And what he is causing with this lawsuit is bad for West Virginia coal miners, bad for West Virginians across the board, bad for the nation, and bad for the world. And it's regrettable that we're at this moment, but I'm here glad to talk about how we are continuing in the fight and how we expect better results in the future. I think we have reasons to be hopeful yet here today.
So I definitely want to talk about reasons to be hopeful before we're through, but let's start with, you practice law, you, as well as being involved with politics. I know you've been involved with labor law, but you have a long history with environmental law as well, don't you?
Well, I worked for Senator Robert C. Byrd for a number of years as the Senate was back in the late 2007 to 2010 era. The Senate was grappling with a number of pieces of legislation to address similar issues. And I was heavily engaged in thinking about how to protect West Virginia's interests in the low carbon economy of the future. During that period, it's been a long struggle over the past 15 years to find our way to that future. And I'm eager to talk about how things have progressed with West Virginia and climate policy over that period. It's been a fascinating and important time for this state and, for the nation as we try to figure out what the future holds for us.
And, one of the things that, before we get into this Supreme Court ruling, one of the things that is so important for people to understand, two things, really. One is how important state races like yours are, right? Because, I feel as if the media and a lot of progressive people around this country are fixated on national races. They're fixated on presidential, senatorial, congressional, and they are very, very important. Don't get me wrong, but state legislatures, governorships, secretary of state, attorneys general, these are critical races for the future of our country, and this ruling proves it. So I just wanted to make that point, number one. And number two, what you're doing, Sam, is so important because to me, having, again, accompanied Bernie, on that journey through West Virginia and other parts of this country, people, and I want your thoughts on this, people, even on the left, often set up this kind of stereotyped, or I don't know what word to put it, that there's this tension between, let's say, the people of West Virginia or certain rural populations, might be farm populations, might be miners in this case, and environmental interests, right? And in the case of West Virginia, they don't know about flooding and what flooding because of environmental abuse has done to the people of West Virginia. They don't know about leaching, of poisons into the soil. You know the stuff better than me, but they don't know about the poverty that gets left behind, after an area has been mined out or whatever. And it seems to me the future is not just, forgive the language, but raping an environment for short-term gain for a few, but finding ways to benefit the working people and, all the people of a state like West Virginia. And it sounds to me like that's a major area of interest for you as well, right?
Yeah, I represent mostly what I do these days is representing coal miners who are suffering and many times dying at very young ages from black lung disease. It's another way that we remember how you can mine coal in ways that hurt even the miners themselves if companies are allowed to run roughshod and operate illegally and cast aside all these externalities onto the workers and the communities. And it's a real problem. I think that the future for coal miners is really scary, and a lot of people in West Virginia have been scared by their politicians into worrying about their futures and their livelihoods. And it's unfair and it's manipulative. And Mr. Morrissey is been on a crusade to scare the people of West Virginia. When the fact of the matter is, investing in a sustainable, low-carbon economy is one of the greatest things we can do to assure stable employment opportunities in West Virginia in the energy sector over the long haul. All the uncertainty that we have seen during the last 20 years while politicians fight about climate change has caused more coal miners to lose their jobs than ever would have happened if we had established some basic rules establishing low carbon standards in the energy sector, and coal miners would have known the rules of the game, cleaned up their plants, diversified their energy sources, gotten jobs, moving in that direction. That would be far and away a better direction for coal miners and coal mining communities than all of this pot shots from back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. So, I think this decision unfortunately adds to the confusion. I'd be eager to talk about the decision because I think the court has left some space for Joe Biden to strike middle ground and lead us forward and establish ground rules for the low carbon economy that will enable states like West Virginia to flourish.
Well, give us a little background on the decision, if you would, because I think what most people know about it on left or right is, and they may have polarized views on it based on whether they're left or right, but I think basically what most people know is that the EPA has been issuing regulations for decades, many decades now, on what coal companies can do, what other companies can do. And the Supreme Court has basically said, this is impression I'm giving now, my sense of the public impression, the Supreme Court has basically said, unless Congress has explicitly said this is what the law should be, then you, the EPA, do not have the right to issue regulations telling companies what they can or cannot do. Right? That is my sense of the public sense of what this ruling is.
Well, the good news is that the EPA still has a lot of power, notwithstanding this decision, which admittedly the decision's just come out, but I've read it shortly before coming here today. I read it when it came out this morning. And here's the background. President Obama issued what was known as the Clean Power Plan. Okay. And you remember the Clean Power Plan had several different methods of compliance. One of those methods of compliance was similar to how coal companies have complied with environmental regulations forever by essentially cleaning up, putting scrubbers and technology on the plants. The real innovation with the Clean Power Plan was that it also allowed plants to comply by shutting down and replacing their generating capacity with new or different plants. That was the really controversial part that was subject to litigation, specifically here in this case. However, the courts had stopped the Obama administration from adopting that rule years ago, and that rule, the fuel switching compliance method, has never been enforced or enforceable. And the Trump administration came up with its own rule, which was also set aside. So both the Obama and the Trump administration tried to regulate and got stopped by the courts. And this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court now, really most narrowly to say that the Obama administration's approach does not have this approval of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said if the Biden administration wants to use the same fuel switching approach that Obama tried, Congress hasn't given them that authority to use that approach. But Congress should remember the EPA still has massive power under the Clean Air Act and can use it to regulate carbon, and they will. And President Biden has the full power to do that. What Congress now has the chance to do is to step in, as it always has been free to do if they had a will, to step in and provide a different cap and trade type framework or a different regulatory framework. Okay, the court has said Obama's approach to allow fuel switching is not kosher, according to the Supreme Court. The EPA can still regulate carbon, and it's still the responsibility of Congress. If they want to direct how that happens, they should and can step up and do it. But if Congress doesn't act, I think as voters, we ought to still expect the EPA should try again. They have the power to, and I don't want the public feeling defeated. The court has not stopped the EPA yet from using the hammers that are available yet to it under the Clean Air Act. And so I think here's what I believe West Virginia ought to hope for, and most of America would like to see Congress step in and end the uncertainty, end the litigation. Endless litigation and ping-ponging back and forth between the courts is not helpful for coal miners. It's not helpful for mineral owners. It's not helpful for power companies. It's not helpful for the climate, certainly, and it's not helpful for the American public at large. The way to address climate change and to steer our power sector in a better direction is to establish permanent norms that companies can plan around for the 50-year, multi-billion-dollar investments that are required to really massively shift the direction of our power sector. Congress is the only entity that has the staying power and the legislative oomph to set those ground rules and make them stick. So Congress should do that. But if they continue failing, rest assured, President Biden will have the EPA doing everything possible and keeping the pressure on Congress to act.
So before we move on to the things we can do in the future and Congress should be doing, Sam, I just want to make sure I understand what was, not that, forgive my cynicism, not that this court seems to particularly care about principles, but what was the principle it used to decide this against this particular fuel substitution technique? It seems like, from what you're saying, the EPA can still, limit emissions or that kind of thing, but that it can't say, you're allowed to substitute one fuel for another. What was the argument in favor of banning this one particular technique?
Unfortunately, you're putting your finger on the most pernicious part of what the court has done here. They adopted a new rule called that they are calling the major questions doctrine. And the major questions doctrine is a figment of the judicial mind that says, if we think there's a big enough legislative question involved, we're going to strike down a regulation and prevent the executive branch from regulating. So if we think there's enough ambiguity in the background policy, in the background statute, as judges under this major questions doctrine, which the Supreme Court is now endorsing, judges will be empowered to set aside regulations and tell the legislature they have to act on this issue if it is to be addressed as the agency attempted to address it. And that is another sign that this Supreme Court is wading into policy. Those are policy judgments. Those are really what we used to call political questions. There used to be a doctrine called the political question doctrine that, that attempted to respect the judgment of the legislature. The Supreme Court is taking this major questions doctrine and using it to undo regulatory judgments that, it could be much farther reaching than the Clean Air Act decision that we've seen here today. And I think people should read about this major questions doctrine and understand that it is a part of how the current supermajority on the Supreme Court is taking our law into new territory. That should be a concern for all of us.
So they're basically saying if a regulator has a new idea, you're not allowed to have a new idea. Only legislators get to have new ideas, and we won't allow you to have a new idea. That's interesting and disturbing. Okay, well, so let's then talk about, Sam Brown Petsonk, let's talk about what might, so EPA, though, can continue regulating as long as it doesn't presume to have any new ideas. So let's talk about what could, leaving aside, questions of what, mansion or a cinema, or for the time being, just theoretically, what kind of legislation can you imagine in terms of fuel transition and so on, that could not only address the climate emergency, but also benefit the people of West Virginia?
Thankfully, because of regional carbon trading programs, because of the rising cost of coal, because of the decreasing cost of natural gas, we're seeing a lot of change in the power sector in coal-reliant states like West Virginia. We're seeing a lot of innovation in residential and commercial solar, which is employing exponentially growing numbers of workers across our state and across the country. I think the economy is proving the point that our nation is capable of innovating in the energy space. We need to see that continue. But the way that energy markets operate is, and they've always operated this way, it's a utility, and there needs to be ground rules to allow the market to operate for a utility. We have to serve every customer that needs electricity. So throughout the history of electric power, it has always been a regulated marketplace. We need regulation to ensure equity and access to electric power in America. So we do need Congress to act. And, I was very involved in helping Senator Byrd and the Congress and Senate, especially 15 years ago, to examine these questions. And, the Congress has, both Democrats and Republicans, have relied on this somewhat controversial approach called emissions trading. And that's a Republican idea that started with the Clean Air Act amendments really in the early 1990s. And emissions trading enables a combination of compliance options, and it has worked in the sulfur, in the acid rain crisis, and for mercury emissions as well. And our grid has cleaned itself up and solved some major environmental problems that way. Whether Congress sees fit to use an emissions trading system for carbon ultimately is still an open question, and there are a variety of approaches that the Senate is currently considering. But the upshot of it has to be that we have long-term expectations about the price you pay for emitting carbon. As long as coal miners and mineral owners and electric power companies and coal miners themselves understand the price you pay for emitting carbon, they can factor that into their investment decisions and they can produce accordingly. And same for every other power source. And what we need is Congress to establish long-term certainty in the for the price of carbon. And that's we need for that to happen very badly. We will continue to see rapid gains and losses in jobs and investment across not only the coal mining sector, but every other energy sector across the country. That's bad for workers. It's bad for producers. It's just bad for the world and bad for America. So we need that long-term certainty. And Richard, I know that there's an active debate as to whether emissions trading is the best way to get us there. But it is something that has worked for mercury, for acid rain, and this is an urgent problem. It's an urgent problem for workers who are being slingshotted between jobs and are trying to put food on the table. They deserve certainty. And the people of West Virginia deserve certainty. We deserve rules of the road to lead us to a more diversified economy. So I favor the most familiar and effective option that can get us to that status of sustainable certainty for workers and the climate. And I pray that the Congress will see fit to enact that type of a bill very soon.
Sam, I don't mean to put you on the spot, so it's fine if you don't know the answer off the top of your head, but I'm just curious. What percentage of the West Virginia workforce is in mining? Do you know?
Yeah, well, that has changed a lot. 20 years ago, it was probably 20 to 30,000 workers directly employed in the mining industry. The West Virginia hit the peak coal, so to speak, the peak coal production around the year of 2000. Just as George Bush came into office, coal production started a slow and steady decline. George W. Bush. Coal production started a slow and steady decline and has continued basically ever since. Coal production has been up over the last year since President Biden came into office, but it was down. We lost over 100 coal-fired power plants during the Trump administration, and the decline has been consistent. Why is that? Most of the productive coal mines in West Virginia are all played out. There is still a lot of coal in West Virginia, but it's narrow seams where you have to cut through a lot of sandstone, causing miners to get silicosis and causing a lot of stranded costs because you're mining rock and that you don't make money off of mining rock. So these mines are marginally productive. So coal production has declined now. There's probably 10,000 miners left in West Virginia, maybe less, depending on the year. It fluctuates. But it's a very significant source of employment and cash flow in some of the poorest counties in this country. Yeah. And that is why nationally, the coal industry means a great deal to the senators who represent states like West Virginia, and it should. And, what those counties, where I live, okay, and I represent in our Democratic Party here a county that is a series of counties that are structurally reliant on tax revenue from coal mines. The thing we need above all in these areas of the country is stability. Boom and bust does not help us here anyway. We need to have rules of the road so that our miners and our renewable energy suppliers can all get busy in a stable, sustainable fashion. That's what our government really owes to the American people after so many years of uncertainty in political football around energy policy.
And it seems to me, Sam, that, a lot of the conversation around a new energy economy is based, we talk, and I'm not talking about you and me, of course, I'm talking about the country as a whole. We talk about employment, of course, but it seems to me a lot of it is based on the macro economy, right? Not the labor economy. It seems to me that we don't talk about how can we build a new energy economy, a sustainable energy economy that works for West Virginia, that works for Michigan, that works for Ohio, that works for all the states that are going to, Arizona, that Nevada, that it seems to me that, and I have trouble picturing it, to be completely honest with you. I have trouble understanding. I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, states that have, and particularly parts of states that have fallen on very hard times. And even when times are okay, they're actually really bad, in my view. So you can tell I worked for Bernie, in my view. So when I try to envision a better future for a state like West Virginia, and a better future that doesn't involve miners getting sick with silicosis or whatever. It may involve some mining going forward, sure, but that I'm still having trouble imagining it and picturing it, and I don't know how to get there from here. And maybe you have a better idea than me, or a better idea how to build that picture. I don't know. Well, but
I want to thank you for asking that question. And I want to turn it right around and give your viewers a job to do leaving this show today. If you have connections to a part of the country that has been struggling, that has been one of the areas of systemic poverty and underdevelopment that Richard's just described, go home to those areas. I got the hell out of Washington when Senator Byrd passed away, because it was clear to me we weren't going to be solving any problems around there for a long time to come. And I came back to West Virginia, and that is step one, because there's no silver bullet for diversifying the economies of our, the post-industrial economies all across this country, whether it's the cutover areas of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, or the gold cotton fields in the South Carolina, or the Mississippi Delta, or Central Appalachia that has been historically reliant on coal mining, or wherever you go, being close to the people, accompanying the communities that have raised us and given us the chance to become who we are as people, is the only way we're going to find our path to a diversified, sustainable, real economy, or I would say also to a diversified, sustainable political economy. I mean, our democracy is suffering because our people are suffering right now, and our democracy is behaving scared because our people are behaving scared. And so in West Virginia and Appalachia, we're lucky because we have, President Kennedy had the foresight to create the Appalachian Regional Commission, and Senator Byrd had the foresight 50 years ago to 70 years ago to understand that long-term infrastructure development was a component of long-term equity for the American periphery. And so, President Biden's essential wisdom in prioritizing the bipartisan infrastructure bill as a 10-year investment, a 10-year vote of confidence in the American people was a gift that he's given us. And now we've got a decade all across this country where county commissioners and local legislators will be spending billions of dollars. Our job as citizens, I think, is to be here in these communities and to call on those county commissioners and to call on our state delegates to ensure those funds are spent equitably. At least 20% of those federal funds ought to be spent in areas of historic systemic poverty and underdevelopment. And the only way you make that happen is being here in a community and making sure your county commissioners do right. And if we do that, we've got the cash flowing from the federal government now to make a permanent rebalancing in uneven development within America. And I think it'll have massive beneficial effects on our political economy and on the lives and the livelihoods of our citizens.
One last thing I'm going to mention, Sam, before I let you go, because you're in southern West Virginia, more or less, which is, since I've been tracking that part of the country. And by the way, I'm from Utica, New York, which when it got hit, it's Rust Belt, right? So the population there, it's changed a little bit, but it was half what it was when I grew up. That's whole parts of the city look like an H-bomb hit it, right? And so I know exactly what you're talking about from a different angle. And but in southern West Virginia, one of the coal companies, I think it was, tried to take over some public roads. You probably know about this, and put gates across them. And people said, no way. Some gathered outside a Hobby Lobby, some gathered in front of the gates and demanded that the gates be opened up. Now, I doubt those people would call themselves lefties or, Occupy Wall Street. They were none of that. But those were people who took it upon themselves to object to injustice, and they got it done. And I would say if we can get that spirit in southern West Virginia, Utica, New York, and Vallejo, California, and Detroit, Michigan, wherever we can do it, I would say the other piece of that is we can get that can-do spirit going, we're going to have a better country quicker than any of us can realize. But I'll give you if you got a closing thought, I'll give it to you.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And, you know, it was probably around 2004, a really prescient book came out by Bill Bishop, who was a newspaper editor from Whitesburg, Kentucky. The book was called The Big Sort. And it was all about studying how America had sorted itself economically, racially, and sort of voluntarily resegregated itself through the 80s and the 90s. And that book really affected my thinking, because coming from an area, you know, I'm originally from north central West Virginia, very much like Utica. You know, old steel mills and coal mines had shut down, and all the kids that I grew up with, you know, we watched our parents lose the health insurance they'd worked a lifetime to earn, and to come down with black lung disease, and you know, lose their jobs and their retirement, their pensions, and companies haul off to bankruptcy court. And you know, the big sort leaves us when we sort ourselves into extremes and only live around people who have the same political philosophy as ourselves. We lose the ability to solve those problems. And I think the last 20 years has demonstrated the peril that we face when we don't stick with and accompany places like Utica, places like, you know, Bill Clinton used to talk about a place called Hope, you know, in Hope, Arkansas. And Paul Farmer wrote about the principle, and Oscar Romero wrote about the principle of accompaniment, sticking with people in hard places, through hard times. And we've got to do that. And when we do that, I think it'll lead to better politics, better outcomes. And we have a chance with the infrastructure money, you know, to make those investments. And so I hope we'll all be engaged in doing that and helping turn the tide in Utica and everywhere else down the line. I've got to be hopeful because, you know, the Supreme Court is showing us the price we will pay if we don't turn this battleship.
Well said. And again, my guest has been Sam Brown Petsonk. He is an attorney. He was 2020 candidate for West Virginia Attorney General. And Sam, thanks for your insights and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, sir.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.